I have to tell you that this was like when I'm preparing for, I love preparing for interviews, like looking up people. I actually, in preparing for you, was overwhelmed and somewhat a little bit intimidated because I was like, oh my gosh.
Really?
Yes, because I was like, where do I start? Like, there's just so much that you've done and so varied. Like, how have you ended up in all these different pursuits, different areas?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think the most important thing is just to be open to opportunities and not always be too analytical about what are you going to get from it. Because sometimes the things that you least expect something big to come from, something huge comes from it. If I was to analyze every single move that I was going to make, then yeah, I would have been overwhelmed because I'm like, I would not be able to have achieved all these things. But I would just take one step at a time, do one thing, and it opens up a whole bunch of doors. And thankfully, I have a really supportive family who encourage me, motivate me, and are really proud of me. So that really, really helps too.
So why don't we start with you telling our viewers, people who don't know who you are and what it is you do.
Okay, so...
And why I was so intimidated about talking to you.
Well, I'm Timiebi Aganaba-Jeanty. Very proud of my double-barreled name because I'm proudly Nigerian but married to a Haitian. And I am British-born, Nigerian heritage, Canadian by choice, and a global citizen. I study international affairs, international relations, global politics, global security, international law, and I'm just interested in basically how do we all work together? I mean, there's so many differences and there's so many barriers between us. And international law is the field that I study, and it's how do we come together to make agreements on things when we have such different starting points. And then when you come from a developing country, it's like the barriers are so much higher for you. So how do you actually have a level playing field to be able to negotiate? And that's what I'm really interested in studying, like how to create that level playing field for developing countries.
So let's go right back to the beginning. And how did you end up in this field?
So I studied law at university in the UK for my undergraduate degree. And when I graduated from my undergrad, I decided that I wanted to discover my roots because I grew up in a really small town in England. There was no diversity. I was the only black girl. I was the only black person in my school, in our church, the only black people. And so I decided that I was going to go to law school in Nigeria. And everyone was really, really surprised because it's usually the other way around. People are studying in Nigeria and then they want to come to law school, in the UK especially. And Nigerians love the UK and the US. And I basically went to law school in Nigeria, and it changed my life to just see that all the things that I've been taught, there's a completely different way of looking at things. There's there's different traditions, you have customary law, you have indigenous laws, and international law was just created by a small group of people. And so I got really interested in thinking about, now I've studied law in 2 jurisdictions, in the UK and in Nigeria. How do I now look at a more global law and a more integrated, system of law? Now, when you graduate from university in Nigeria, you have to do like a year's service for the country, so a national youth service. And you get posted somewhere, anywhere. People get posted. If you're from the South, you might get posted way up in the North. You may be a Christian in the South, and you get posted in the North where it's very Muslim. So the whole idea of it was to get some integration in the country because there was so much division. So they developed this national youth service. And I happened to be posted to the Nigerian Space Agency in the Department of Legal Affairs and International Cooperation. So here I really got to see international law at work in an environment that we're talking about, equality because there's no sovereignty in space. So this is on a theoretical level, equality, right? If there's no sovereignty in space, then no one is more important than anyone else. But clearly, there's a power dynamic because you have the NASAs of the world who spend $20 billion a year on space. But I was working at the Nigerian Space Agency with a budget of less than $100 million. So in my mind, I'm thinking, how does NASA, how would I sit at the table with the NASA lawyers and talk about international space law? So I knew I had to go study and I had to go learn more, which is what started off my academic career, because I felt like I was starting from way, way back, you know, competing with these countries that have been involved in space since the 1960s. And here I was at the Nigerian Space Agency trying to figure out what Nigeria's position should be on space debris mitigation, you know, how Nigeria should feel about, you know, about telecommunications rights and things like that. It was really tough. But it was a great way to look at international law because from a theoretical level, I could really think about how can I try and speak for Nigerian rights, you know, in something that sounds as complex as space.
Was space something you'd ever had an interest in?
So when I was 15, my dad took us to NASA in Houston. And I was a typical teenager. I was grumpy. All the pictures, I'm just like, this is so boring. Like, I don't care about this. Grumpy teenager. We had one of these pictures. So at NASA, you know, you can do those pictures where you put on the astronaut's helmet. And literally, I look like I want to cry. So I knew that there was NASA. And I knew that it's a big deal for some people. But I didn't know how it applies to me or how it applies to anyone. So it's really interesting when you work in a developing country perspective because you've got to really get down to a granular level and say, what does this mean beyond a whole bunch of like big movies about aliens in outer space? But even in the Nigerian context, people didn't understand the relevance because they say, we don't even have electricity supply. We don't have power. And you're talking about going to space. And my job was always to tell, you know, I was constantly telling people, that's not the intention. We're not talking about going to the moon and going to Mars. We're talking about how do we get communication services? How do we get internet access? How do we get Earth observation data so we can monitor our borders, so we can tell what our fishery stocks is like? What are the applications that come from space as opposed to space, you know?
The final frontier.
Right.
And that's an interesting observation that, you know, you just pointed out to us, because I think for many people, they'd be surprised that there are African countries that have space programs. I think we're all used to what we see in the movies and, you know, Apollo and all of those kinds of, is the space program on the African continent quite widespread?
Yeah, so we do have a few countries. I mean, over 6 countries. And there was one report I saw. I don't want to be quoted on this, but one report from Space in Africa group that said Africa has spent over $3 billion since 2000 on space programs. And so there is this idea that African countries do want to get in on these applications because they don't want anymore these black box solutions. You know, so much of our history, people came and then they solved the problem, and you don't know what was the cause of the problem. You don't know how, if something gets broken, you don't know how to fix it. So space was one area that is ambitious, but you can develop your science and engineering capacities. You know, you need to think of the educational system to be able to have people to be able to do this. And right now, actually, that the African Union are adopting an African space, they adopted an African space policy, and there's going to be an African space agency. So there's going to be an African-wide program so that all these other little countries can benefit without themselves having to develop space programs. Because obviously, building a space program from scratch is like a really big deal. But it should be part of a big agenda, like a bigger agenda than just, oh, we're going to build a space agency. It's part of either an innovation and science and technology capability agenda, or some people have it as part of, it could be the Ministry of Economy because you're thinking of all the apps that you can develop using this data. So there's lots of different ways. In Nigeria, it was under science and technology and also under the Ministry of Communications Technologies.
So you go and do your was it a year
Yes.
that you did at the Nigeria Space Agency?
Yes.
And then what happened next? Where did you go after that?
And then I realized there's so much that I need to learn. I was 24 years old, right? And that's kind of a big job. I was in the inaugural department. It was the first department. And so I realized I need to go study. So I went to the International Space University in France, and I did a Master of Science in Space Program Management. And, there I learned all about all the aspects, from the engineering to the science to the policies and the laws and, all different aspects of it. And just was blown away because I loved working with engineers. This is where I realized that I'm not a classic lawyer. Like, I didn't just want to be with lawyers. I love being with people that have a whole variety of perspectives and sitting at the table with all these different viewpoints. And I was I think there were 2 of us that were lawyers in our class, and everyone else was scientists and engineers. And I loved these guys because they had such rich questions, questions that, what is law? That is a big philosophical question. And a lawyer might not particularly ask you that because they assume that they know what that means. But an engineer asking you, so what do you mean by law? I had to really think, okay, so what in this context, if we're talking about space, what is law? What is space law? What does that mean? So it was a really interesting experience. And when I graduated, they offered me a job at that university as a teaching associate. So I was then the teaching associate for the program. And because I now worked in a university, PhD now became a normal word. And so my advisor, my professor, Walter Peters, was always telling me, you have to do a PhD, you have to do a PhD. So that's what ended up getting me to do my PhD here in Canada at McGill.
But before, you talked about some of your classmates asking the philosophical question of what is law. I'll ask you a philosophical question. What is space? So when you talk about, I did a master's in space management. What is space?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question because it can mean a lot of different things. Like if you're talking space, from where I'm at right now I'm studying environmental law, international environmental law. So space to me right now is a global commons. It means it's an area beyond national jurisdiction, but it's an area, it's a location, right? So it's simply a location. That's all space is. So to other people, to an engineer who builds robots, space is all about, I want to go to Mars and explore a planet and find out, is there water or is there life or something on this planet? So space to them is all about robotics engineering, right? But then you may look at somebody who does Earth observation and they collect data about the Earth. So space for them is simply a place that gives you a lens to be able to look down on Earth from a long distance, to have continuous data about a specific area on Earth. So space just gives you a different vantage point in which to look at a certain problem. So space can mean something different to a whole bunch of people. And we use this word space, and most people don't know what it means. And so I think we need to do a better job at explaining, what do you mean when you're saying you're a space lawyer? Now I look at myself as somebody who understands areas outside of national jurisdiction, areas where no one has a say and everyone has a say. So we're talking about the oceans, we're talking about the atmosphere, we're talking about the deep seabed, we're talking about space.
So when you finished your master's at the space university and then decided you're going to do it. And then you did some time as teaching at the university.
Yeah.
And then decided you were going to do a master's. And you said you went to McGill. What did you study when you went to McGill?
Right. So at McGill, I did another master's at McGill. Which
one wasn't enough.
Yeah, because
well, actually two, technically.
That first master's was a Master of Science. Mm-hmm. Now I realized, okay, I've had the interdisciplinary experience, but you've got to be core in your discipline because you have to know, what do I bring to interdisciplinarity, right? And at the end of the day, I'm a lawyer, so I need to be grounded in space law, because in a conversation full of engineers, if they have a legal question, I can't just be another person in the room. Everyone's going to turn around and say, well, you're the lawyer. So I had to go study space. So I did a master's in space law and at McGill, before I did my PhD at McGill. And my PhD was really focused on this idea of how do we get benefits from space and how do developing countries get benefits from space. But while I was doing my PhD, I actually worked at a consulting company in Montreal. There's a consulting company in Montreal that's focused on the space sector. So they advise banks who are financing satellite projects. They advise all the space agencies. They're big clients of the Canadian Space Agency. So during my PhD, I had very practical experience working, in the industry while I was working on the theoretical concept of space benefit.
So you talked about benefits and developing countries. What would you say are the biggest benefits that developing countries can realize from space and space programs?
Yeah, so what's really interesting is that there's lots of different price points, right? If we look at the top 10 countries in terms of civil government spending in space, you see the diversity. You have US at the top at something like 20 billion or something billion. You have China, who spends a lot too, and Russia. And then you get down to like India's of the world, who are spending like 1 billion. And then you get down to countries like Canada, who are spending like 200 to 400 million, down to countries who are spending 200,000. So there's a whole range depending on what are your development objectives. So an easy one that people use to start off with is Earth observation. How do I look at my territory? And how do I get a better understanding of mapping my territory, of knowing where my resources are, right? And some of these datas were available. You don't need your own satellite, but for some people, there are a lot of conditions on access to this information. So some people don't want to share the data. So you end up saying, okay, well, I'm going to build a satellite because then I know that I will be in control of the information about myself. In Nigeria, when they first decided to have telecommunication satellites, they realized we're spending so much money on telecommunication services. And if you think even in African countries, even sometimes you would be routed to the other side of the world before you could call your neighbor, mm-hmm. right? So these systems were not designed for you as a primary user. So the idea of the Nigerian telecommunication satellite was that we are a big enough market to provide our own communication services. And why not have an African telecommunications company that can service the African market? So Nigeria being a big country in Africa, I don't know how many million, which statistics are right, but we have the capacity that we can provide these services. We have the brain power, the intellect. And so, there are many people studying all over the world, to be able to get the knowledge to do this. But you can start off at a graduated level. And the Nigerian space program was also developed really based on this idea of science and technology capability development. So how do we train the next generation of scientists and engineers to think innovatively, to be able to get in on this, this very global, market?
So when you graduated from McGill, then what did you do? What was your next step career-wise?
Right. So when I graduated from McGill, the idea was I am now hyper focused and specialized on space. I need to get back out and get some perspective. So I moved to Waterloo, and I moved to the Center for International Governance Innovation, which is a think tank that was founded by Jim Balsillie, who was the founder of BlackBerry. And this center is really that we're basically involved in all the global governance processes, whether it's the World Trade Organization, whether it's the World Intellectual Property Organization, whether it's the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, whether it's the Convention on Biodiversity. Like, CG is involved in all these different global processes. And I said to myself, I need to learn about how do we solve these global problems, because space is very abstract. And I wanted to get experience of issues that we're dealing with right now that space could be a solution to. So I picked climate change. Climate change is a topic, it's very topical right now. We had the Paris Agreement on climate change was signed in 2015, and almost all countries of the world signed onto this agreement. So I said, that is the thing that I'm going to look at. And Article 13 of the Paris Agreement talks about transparency. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to have an agreement, how are you going to make sure that that agreement is kept up with? So I'm like, climate change, transparency, satellites, it all makes sense. I can look at how can satellites help with monitoring greenhouse gas emissions, so how can satellites help with mitigation, and how can satellites help with adaptation? So how can satellites help you figure out what are the problems, how do you see the problems of climate change? How can we monitor that there is actually sea level rise? And how can we see the coastal erosion and all these kind of things? So it was a really, really great mix. So I spent the past 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow working on international environmental law and climate change, and also looking at how other emerging technologies can actually contribute to helping with climate change. So I looked at a real buzz technology. A buzz technology of 2017 was definitely blockchain. So I was looking at blockchain, artificial intelligence, big data. So how do all these new disruptive technologies, how can they actually contribute to solving the problem of climate change? So, it's an ongoing work, but I had a really, really great 2 years there, and actually I'm really rounding up my postdoc there because it's coming to the end of my postdoc now.
So you said your time at CG is coming to an end. So what's next?
Yeah, so I'm very, very excited because I've accepted a position as an assistant professor at the School for the Future of Innovation and Society at Arizona State University in the US. So I'm really excited about this next phase of continuing to look at the things I've been looking at. So space governance, environmental governance, emerging technologies, and look at the future of innovation in these spaces. And the most important thing for me when I look at technology and innovation is how does that affect society? So the societal implication gets lost, especially when you're around techies and engineers and they just care about fixing things and building things. You have to, as the lawyer, you have to take a step back. But I don't want to be the kind of lawyer that says it will never work or you can't do it, or be that kind of person that comes in the room and everybody wants to keep quiet because they don't know. No, because I want to see innovation. I want to see these things, but I want to see how can they evolve in a way that is socially conscious, that is inclusive, that doesn't harm people in the long run. So that's what's next, and I'm super excited to move to the US.
So this is quite a transition. You're going from being in a think tank, very much research oriented, to academia. Like, what do you see as being the biggest change for you as you transition into academia?
The biggest change, and what I'm most excited about, is inspiring the next generation. Some people see teaching as, basically teachers are the most underappreciated people there are. I mean, a professor is different because as a professor in society, obviously you have that level of appreciation. But teaching is so fundamental. The next generation, the ideas that they have, the self-esteem that they have is just so important. And I'm so excited I'm very passionate about what I do. And I'm really excited about sharing my passion with my students and drawing out of them, what do they want to do and how can they change the world? And the reason that I'm excited to do that in America is because, despite everything that's going on, America is amazing. So, in the interview, I was blown away because they're asking you questions like, you know, what's your vision? How are you going to change the world? What are you going to do? And that's exciting to have that kind of platform where people really want to hear, how are you, with this platform that you're being given, and we're going to give you all the resources to do that, how are you going to have an impact in the world? That's what I love about Arizona State University, is they're ranked #1 for innovation in the US, and their mantra is the future is for everyone. And their philosophy is that we don't rate ourselves based on who we exclude, but who we include and what happens to them afterwards. So that's what I'm really excited about. But it's going to be very different, because the thing about inclusion comes with a lot of challenges. You know, if you go to a Harvard classroom, all your kids are going to be totally prepared. They know why they're there. They know what they're doing. As soon as you start trying to include people from a diverse pool, you have people coming in with different challenges. So I think it's going to be different for me when I get to ASU, because I'm going to meet those diverse students. You know, so some that come from different types of backgrounds, some that are more motivated than others. So I'm going to have to really dig deep to find everything there is within me to bring out the best that I can in those kids.
So you talked about them asking you in the interview process about the impact that you want to have in the world. What is the impact that you want to have in the world?
That's a great question. The biggest thing that I want to do is really show people what's possible. I think that there's so many things to tell us that you can't do it. Even if those things are indirect, but there's symbols around us. There are things that even our parents say because they're trying to protect us that make us feel that we can't do things and that we can't put ourselves out there. We're so scared of the ramifications of putting our hand up and having an opinion. And there are ramifications, right? We see that. I mean, people hate politicians, but I think that's really hard to take a stand on something. And that's why someone gets elected, because they're able to stand up and say, this is what I believe. I believe this, I'm going to stand up for this, and all of you can stand behind me, and I will take the brunt of it. And that's what I'm passionate about, telling people that, you know what, you can do something that most people might laugh at you. When I say I work in the Nigerian Space Agency, people would laugh. People would say, you don't even have anything in your country. People are starving and dying. What are you doing here? And you have to have the confidence to say, I'm going to stand up and talk to the head of NASA. I remember I went to a conference in the United Arab Emirates when I was executive director of the World Space Week Association. And I was really intimidated to go talk to the head, because, you know, they're dressed in their beautiful clothes, and in Dubai, everything is very fancy. And I was with ambassadors. And I remember the ambassador from Cameroon or from one of these other countries, he said to me, why are you intimidated? Go and talk to him. You're the head of your organization. He's the head of his organization. That's how you have to deal with him. But I was looking at myself as just a small girl, and he's like this big Emirati prince. But no, so those words follow me forever, for the rest of my days, is that no, you might feel that you're just a small girl, but you guys are equals, because he's running something and you're running something. So talk to him at that level. And that's the message that I really want to get to people, is that you should act to where you want to be. Start taking steps towards acting where you want to be, not necessarily where you are, because then the rest of the world will start seeing you in a different light.
Has that been a challenge for you, being seen a certain way as a Black woman in a world where typically it is very dominated by white men, and especially being a Black African woman? Has that hindered you in any way, and how have you felt that?
So, you know, the funny thing for me, actually, I've found that there's been such low expectations that, you know, with determination, it's been easier to make an impact, because people didn't even think I could do anything. For many, many people, that realization would bring them down. It would make them feel like, if people don't think I can do anything, then really I can't do everything. But the way I am now is I say, you know what, I'm going to go into that room and I'm going to blow those people away because they're not expecting much from me. And that's motivating me that actually I now educate those people that, oh my goodness, you can't underestimate people, because this person actually can contribute to the discussion. And so I really have found that now I see being a Black woman as a strength, because in this day and age where you need different perspectives to be able to solve global issues, you need the African woman at the table. So the African woman who you before was at the bottom of the totem pole, I would say now is climbing up fast.
And what would be your biggest piece of advice to a young woman, a young African woman who's looking at you and inspired by you and what you're doing? What should they be doing? What's the advice you'd give them?
I think there's two things that are important. One is it is definitely important to find your passion and try and find a way that you can bring these two things together. Because a lot of African young people are pressurized by their parents to study particular things, right? You have to be a lawyer, you have to be a doctor, you have to be a this. But if that's not what you want to do, you'll live a miserable life. So I think it's really important to find your passion, because we're still competing with so many people. You need your credibility. So I feel like an old African parent saying this, but yes, you need to study math and science and English, and you need to ace all your classes, and you need to do the difficult things, because you need to be competitive in today's world and have your passion. No longer can you choose, oh, I'm just going to do one thing or other. You need to be multifaceted, so you need to you need to focus on your strengths, but you need to develop your weaknesses too, so that any situation that you find yourself, you have the tools, the toolkit in which you can use to help yourself. So I would say, get your hands dirty, try out lots of different things so that you can at least say, okay, I know a little bit about that. I'm still working on that. I don't know how to fix a tire. I don't know how to put a tire on a car, and I would still have to call my husband. So I know that, I'm still working on this myself. But we need to choose to rely on people, but not have to be reliant on people, right? So it's a choice that we bring people in to help us, but we need to understand, how can I diversify the things that I do, diversify the people that I interact with, and talk to people who are from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Because I think the thing is, when you've seen poverty, many people want to stay away from it. But there's so much innovation around that. There's so much that can be done. There's so much that you can use your skill sets either to build people up or to learn from, because those people know how to overcome adversity. And if you have a luxurious life, you'll be very shocked when you see that even adversity comes to you. And so you need to figure out, how am I going to deal with this? And the other thing I had to learn, because unfortunately I lost a child in 2015, that taught me about empathy. Before then, I was a very driven person and, just felt that it's by my works that I do things. Now, when I see someone walking down the street, I have no idea what's going on. I don't know if they're being abused by their husband. I don't know if their child has leukemia and they're going to the hospital every day. So now I've developed this empathy that makes it a lot easier to interact with people, because I really had to suffer myself, and I had to go through something that was so terrible and still have a job and still go to work and still be a friend and a wife and a daughter. So then you're like, how are you going to do all those things? So empathy helps you realize that people are suffering, people are going through things. So if somebody slams at you when they're walking past you, you don't have to be aggressive straight away. You may just think, I don't know what's going on with that person. That person might just need a hand. That person might just need someone to say, are you okay? Is everything okay?
You talked about passion and the need to find your passion. Do you think you found your passion?
Yes. I am so passionate about learning, and I'm so excited that my job is going to be around learning. And I think I'm a lifelong student. I spend my free time listening to podcasts, reading books, listening to audiobooks, any free course, any free lecture, anything, I'm there. And I'm so excited that that's going to be my job. So I'm really, really passionate about that. But I'm also passionate about listening to people who have built things. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to learn, how do I build something? Because it's good to be a researcher. It's great to read and write. That's obviously the core of the tools of a lawyer, is reading and writing and talking. But how do I start building things? Something that is a legacy, something that many people are going to benefit from. And that's why I'm interested in working in innovation, because innovation is about creating new products and services, taking old things and finding new ways of using them. So that's my next passion. My next passion is, how do I start building things? And in my academic career, what I would like to do is get into different kinds of partnerships with people who want to look at building new things, looking at the future and saying, what new solutions can we develop? And how do we need to research that? And how can we include people in that process?
You talked about your love of sharing knowledge, about inspiring the next generation. I know something that you did a little while ago, which is actually how I came across you and found out about you, was you did something called Ladies Do Launch. Can you talk about that, what it is and why you started it?
Right. So as I said, any free event that is about learning, you'll find me there. And the University of Waterloo did something, Waterloo Women. And it was all about ideas, women coming together to share ideas. And it was mostly University of Waterloo students. And I went there because I realized I'm really interested in women. And I want to do something with women. And I don't quite know what. So I came up with this idea of Ladies Do Launch, because I thought, I'm going to have some kind of group, a network of ladies who are interested in STEM, science, technology, who are interested in space, who want to go for lunch. So I called it Ladies Do Launch. And I said, how am I going to figure out what are the needs of these women? And so I went to this event at the University of Waterloo and was working with all these young female engineers who were talking about the challenges of mentorship, not having mentors, not having sponsors, not knowing, how to navigate their way around. And they had joined Women in Engineering, and they found that there wasn't practical stuff for them. And some of these students, they joined LinkedIn, but they were too intimidated to actually reach out to anyone, and they felt that nobody would really respond to me. So then I thought, Ladies Do Launch can be that platform, can be that place where women can come to get inspiration, to find mentors. But then I thought, well, what am I actually going to do? How am I going to do it? And so for International Women's Day, I decided to look through my network and find really inspiring females, engineers and scientists from all around the world, so I would have a global distribution, to really talk about how did they get into what they're doing? How did they find their passion around space? And the podcast series for International Women's Day, it was great because I had from South Africa, the chair of the United Nations Committee on Space. I had industrial engineers from Saudi Arabia. I had, women from all around the world really, talking about International Women's Day and what their passions meant to them and how they got around to that. So I really hope to build on that platform to be able to continue engaging with women and maybe broaden it out, not just people who are interested in space, broaden it out to people who are interested in personal development, who are interested in sharing ideas. And I guess the core is going to be around innovation.
What's your greatest dream for yourself?
Wow. My husband is from Haiti, and my husband was adopted. And he's so thankful for life. Every day, he's just thankful that he's here, that he had the opportunities that he had. and he's built the life that he's built for himself. And so he's such an inspiration for me. And one of his biggest passions is actually about giving early childhood education and giving young people who, like him, grew up potentially with nothing, an opportunity to live the kind of life that we live now. So actually, one of my greatest ambitions, you're making me think of it now, is as a wife, supporting my husband in his dream of being able to help millions of children all around the world, developing countries particularly, to have a really good education. And it just works out that I'm also going to be developing those skills because I'm going to be working in a university. So I'm going to be learning the skills of education, and he's a businessman. So we can add together, you know, my understanding of education with his background, with his MBA and his background in business, to basically do that creation, that building that I'm talking about, like building something that is going to have a legacy that is going to help millions, hopefully millions of people all around the world. So that's really my dream is tied up with my husband's.
But let's go back to you, and that's an incredible dream, and incredible as well that you're talking about, supporting your husband's dream, but that dream is bigger than just the two of you. But I'm interested to go back to you and to ask you, what are you most proud of that you've achieved so far?
I think everyone knows that doing a PhD is hard. I was writing a PhD at the hospital bed of my son. So while I was sitting at his bedside writing my thesis, all that was going on in my head was, when I come out of hospital with my son and he's older, I'm going to tell him about adversity. I'm going to tell him about the struggles that we have in life, but how when you have a goal, when you have a vision, nothing can stop you and you can keep working at your dreams. And that was what kept me going with my PhD. And I finished my PhD and I came out of hospital with a PhD thesis, but without a son. So my PhD thesis is like my baby. I'm so proud of that thing. I'm not proud of it in terms of its content, but I'm proud of the fact that I was able to do it, and the inspiration behind that was about teaching my son about the complexity of life. So when I look at my PhD thesis, which is really about how do I get developing countries and developed countries to come together to be able to talk about a global governance issue, at the back of my mind was, I'm going to have a son that's going to be able to change the world, that's going to be able to solve the problem that my PhD identified. So that's what I'm most proud of, that I was able to do it, that I was able to come out, and I finished the PhD, and believe it or not, my career just went up from there. You know, I won multiple awards. Last year, I won the Young Space Leader Award from the International Astronautical Federation, which is like, you know, I won an International Women's Day Award in Montreal for contribution to Quebec society. And all this happened after my son died. And so I can't believe that all those things happened. So I'm really proud of myself for that. But I'm really careful also to acknowledge that the reality for many people would be very different. And for some people, it would completely destroy them and break them. So I don't want to sit here and say I'm some kind of Wonder Woman that was able to do all this. God, that's the way God created me, that I was able to deal with these things, but I learned the empathy that other people have a different experience. So I share my story, not to say that I was able to do it, so you have to do it as well, but to say that there's many different ways that we deal with adversity. And if it takes you a longer time, then it takes you a longer time. But there is a path at the end of it. You can overcome the difficulty in your own time and in your own way. You know, my husband dealt with my son's death in a completely different way. It was it was heartbreaking for both of us, but we dealt with it in completely different ways. So I've seen the other side where it completely stops you from being able to do everything. And so that's really my message about adversity is really that I learned how to dig deep, how to look at my situation and not be my situation, and just be able to look above it and see a bright tomorrow. And that's the thing now that I've learned the most, is that almost nothing can keep me down because I always see a bright tomorrow.
What are you most grateful for?
My family. I have the most supportive husband. He is my biggest cheerleader. He comes to all my events. You know, when I was doing my PhD, he would be there by my side saying, "Have you written today? Have you done this today?" You know, we're moving to Arizona. He has to quit his job and he has to come with me to another country. And he's pretty established here. So I'm really grateful that I have that. I have a father who, my PhD is dedicated to the men in my life, my father, my husband, my son, because they were the core to keep me going. And of course, I appreciate my mother because my mother is a woman of no fear. She always says, "You're the daughter of a lion, so why should you be afraid? You know, you're the daughter of a lion." That's what she always says. I don't know where she gets that strength from. Well, she gets that strength from her faith. She's very, very strong in her faith. So I'm really, really grateful. My faith, I need to work harder. But I thank God that my mom is praying for me because she's a real prayer warrior. So, you know, my family is what I'm really thankful for.
So you talked about fear and the fact that your mom says you have nothing to be afraid of. But are you afraid of anything? Is there anything you are afraid of?
I'm afraid of not fulfilling my potential. And the problem with that is that you don't want to put too much pressure on yourself. Because my life so far hasn't been so planned. Things have kind of happened, but I've gotten to a point where I have a platform. So now I feel that I have so much to accomplish. And the problem with that is once you start putting that kind of pressure, you may not achieve the things that you want to achieve. So I think you've got to find a balance. That's what I'm really trying to work on. How do I find a balance between being very ambitious and just letting go and letting God? You know, God has a plan for me. And so I don't have to over-try. I don't have to overdo it. I just have to be myself. And just that's enough. So I'm scared of trying to be too ambitious and trying to do too much and trying to just keep myself just being myself.
What's the best advice you've ever been given?
I have it written down from my mom. Fear is a habit. My mom said, "My fear is a habit. I'm just used to being afraid." I have a conference, you know, when I used to be afraid of speaking, because I do a lot of speaking. She's like, "You're only afraid because you're used to being afraid. It's a pattern. So you have a pattern and a habit of fear. So you need to just get rid of that habit. So see fear as a habit. Once you start seeing it as a habit, just like smoking is a habit or not exercising is a habit, you can start working on fear. And once you've gotten rid of fear, I mean, nothing is stopping you. So really, that advice from my mom, anytime I'm afraid, I just say, "Timmy, you're only afraid because you're used to being afraid. You can choose something else. You don't have to be afraid in this context. You can just get up and just go." And that's what keeps me moving.
So you've talked about your mom and the incredible advice she's given you, as well as just how courageous, fearless she is. Who are some other women who inspire you?
So there's one woman Nigerian woman who I don't know her, but I feel like we would be friends. And this is Chimamanda. She's a Nigerian author. She wrote some amazing books, Half of a Yellow Sun, Purple Hibiscus. And she's really the first Nigerian author that I really got to read. And I read her books. I love her books. They're just so easy to read, and they tell this for someone who grew up outside of Nigeria. They tell you kind of the story of what Nigerians went through, the Biafran War and all the different kind of experiences that, Nigerian people have. And one time I went to a restaurant and she was on the other table, and I never really reached out and spoke to her, but her TED Talk on the single story was the first TED Talk I ever saw, and my dad sent it to me, and I listened to it, and I really saw her, and I thought, wow, we could be friends. She could be my friend. And so I really admire her, and I would love to meet her one day. So she's one of the people that, that I can think of right now. There's tons of people, but right now she's one that I admire. The second person that I have to give a lot of credit to, she doesn't know me at all, but she's a professor at, she's the Dean of Graduate Studies at Flinders University in Australia. Her name is Tara Brabazon. She has a YouTube video every week that she gives out to graduate students. And she has over 150 videos. I've watched every single one of them. And each and every single one of them is filled with so much information about all kinds of things, whether it's from how do you publish in a journal, how do you talk to the media, how do you write an article, what sources do you use, all kinds of knowledge. But it's just incredible. And one of the last episodes that I saw, she revealed that her husband had died 2 months ago. But she'd still been doing these videos every single week. So basically, I relate very much to her because of the experience that I went through. And I saw my experience in a completely different lens because I was looking at her thinking, how did she do that? How was she able to still be so functional? So there's many people that we can draw inspiration from. But again, like I said, the problem is we don't want to compare, right? We don't want to say, oh, that person is some kind of superwoman, because another woman might have a different experience. But I try and look to people like that, people who I can look at and say, wow, over the odds, they overcome. This is what I love. This is why my husband is so inspirational to me, because of what he has overcome. That's really the kinds of people that I find, really drawn to.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tim. It's truly been an incredible pleasure. I've so enjoyed spending time with you. I wish you the very best in your journey as you move to Arizona and everything that's going to come after. Where can people find more information about you, about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm pretty active on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Timiebi89. And on LinkedIn, I really love the LinkedIn platform. I think it's a really great network, and I share a lot of my thoughts, and I share a lot of interesting things that I read on LinkedIn. So I would really be happy for people to follow me on LinkedIn too.
One last question. So this platform is called Ndini, which in my mother tongue, Shona, means I am. Finish that sentence for me. I am.
Trying to be fearless.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You're absolutely wonderful. I'll give you a hug. You're amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So wonderful.
Thank you.
Yay, it's over.